So one of the things we want to be able to do is verify identities. There's a little bit of a process to this. This comes up a lot in this section. You can have lots of identities, and verifying them is like you're proving it, like you're saying, okay, this is actually true. It's a statement that you start with. So they're equations, but you don't work with them like you normally work with equations. So a couple ideas. First of all, work on one side. Of the equation. Generally we don't work on both sides of the equation. We take one side and we try to turn it into the other side. So what they're going to have something over here equals something over here. And maybe you're going to work on this side. And so you're going to have the series of steps here. And eventually, at your last step, it's going to look like that. And it has to look exactly like that, okay? And then we usually put a little box here to say we're done, okay? So they didn't really show that, and different, like our trigonometry book, their box looks a little different, but you have something that says, okay, I've completed this verification. They might bring that in later, but I'll go ahead and use that for now. Okay, so work on one side of the equation, work down the page. And I usually, like if I'm giving an exam, I usually try to leave a lot of room because sometimes the writing is big on it. Okay, so work down the page. Don't go sideways because that just kind of messes things up. Okay, so don't do that. All right, so work down the page. Show all your steps. So there's some things, that we can just put in. We can say, oh, well, if I have a sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta, I can replace that with 1. You don't have to put the reason any place, but you could. I'll try to do that as I go through these so you can see it. Let's see. Sometimes students at the beginning, they're thinking, oh, it's an equation. I can add something to both sides or, divide both sides or something. No, we don't do that. We don't work with both sides. We take one side and turn it into the other side so they'll look. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is we usually work the more complicated. Start with the more complicated side. It's easier to take something complicated and simplify it than to take something that's already simplified and try to make it complicated. Sometimes you can't tell. They look about the same, well, one side's just as complicated as the other side. And so it may not matter which side you start on. Okay. But a lot of times you'll be able to say, oh, this is the more complicated side. I want to start with that one. All right. Look for an identity. Now, we've just reviewed the fundamental identities, and so, if I see something that just stands out, like, oh, there's a tangent squared, and I want to get a secant squared, so maybe I'm going to use that identity, that might be an idea, okay? So look for maybe using an identity. Sometimes you're going to have to use some algebra, such as you might have to deal with fractions, factoring. I'll say the difference of squares or conjugates. And remember, and hopefully you're saying, well, oh, great, I know my algebra, that's good. But remember, they're going to look a little different because it will be in terms of trigonometric functions. Okay, but it's the same ideas, okay? And then finally, as a last result, you might try turning everything into sines and cosines. So usually you can do that. You can take a tangent, and put it in terms of sines and cosines. So sometimes that's kind of a last resort, but sometimes we do that. We just put everything in terms of sines and cosines and work with it that way. Now, just one thing on these, because, sometimes students are like, I don't know how to do this verification, or I don't know how to do this problem. The more you practice, the better you'll get. And sometimes you might take a wrong turn. You might start out a problem and you're doing, everything right, but it just isn't getting you somewhere. So I would abandon it and go back to the beginning and try something else. I mean, that happened to me one time a few years ago. I was working on a trig problem and I did like 2 pages of work. Everything was right. I just wasn't going in the right direction. So if you're getting like 2 pages of work, you probably spent too much time on going a particular way and you might want to rethink it. So I don't want to scare you. I just want to tell you that that does happen. Sometimes we just say abandon plans and go back to the beginning and try something else. Okay. And sometimes there's a mistake and maybe we find it that way. But I find these problems really fun to do. And I think, you'll enjoy them, but you have to get used to them just like anything else. So we have some examples. I put in some bonus examples so you can see more examples.